Today we're going to begin a series of modules that deal with energetics in nature, essentially the flow of energy in nature. And today we're going to be looking at an overview of that flow of energy. So let's begin with the laws of energy. There are really two laws of energy, so-called first law of energy, which states that energy is neither created nor destroyed, although energy certainly can change forms. And then the second law of energy, which states that as energy flows through a system, energy dissipates from that system. Again, it can be defined a lot of different ways. Energy goes from a high quality energy to a low quality energy. Energy dissipates, energy degrades over time, or as it flows through a system. But essentially the idea is this, that if we imagine energy being produced, electrical energy being produced at Hoover Dam. There are generators there and they're going to produce a certain amount of electrical energy. And that electrical energy then will feed through wires and eventually get to San Diego. Now the quantity of electrical energy that gets to San Diego is going to be less than what enters the wires at Hoover Dam. So at first that seems to be a contradiction of the first law of energy, which says that energy is neither created nor destroyed. But what's happening is that as the energy is flowing through the wires, the electricity is flowing through the wires, some of that energy is being lost to the surroundings in the form of heat, perhaps light, but the point is that energy slips out of the system. So that if we were to take the energy that actually is delivered to San Diego and combine that with the energy that is lost from the system along the way, that total energy would be equal to the energy that was entering the wires. So this has implications when we look at life then, because again, that's one of the reasons we have to eat every day. You know, you may have had breakfast this morning or you may have lunch, but you're going to have to eat again because that food has energy. And over time, that energy is going to dissipate, and so you have to bring in more high-quality energy. So the first and second laws then are really important in how nature functions, and I'll be coming back to that concept, particularly the second law. Now, another thing I want you to keep in mind as we talk about ecosystems, and we've talked about this a little bit already, is that matter, the molecules, atoms and molecules and so on, they cycle in nature. They're going to be reused over and over and over again. So really the carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and so on that you and I are composed of are really as old as the Earth itself, 4.6 billion years old. But energy cannot be recycled because of the second law. You cannot start and end with the same amount and same type of energy as it goes through a system. So energy then has to flow through ecosystems and it cannot be recycled. So this source of energy then is going to be a critical thing to consider. Now, just one other reminder, I'm going to be talking about molecules and so on and how much energy they contain, but I do want you to keep in mind that the basic unit of chemistry is the mole. So when I say molecule, I'm really talking about moles of particles, 6.02 times 10 to the 23rd particles. And then also I'll be talking about kilocalories, and just a reminder that kilocalories are a unit of heat energy. I maybe see reference to joules. Joules is also, or kilojoules, are also a measure of energy. So again, kilocalorie, a measure of heat energy specifically, joules and kilojoules, a measure of energy more generically. All right, so when it comes down to the very basic level, and we'll be coming back to some of these concepts in future modules, but ATP is a really critically important molecule in life. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. This is the adenosine component here. And then you can see that there are three phosphate groups bound together. And the outer two phosphates are described as being bound by high energy bonds. They don't really have necessarily more energy than any other covalent bond, but they're relatively easily broken bonds. Now, ATP is really important because that's the usable form of energy in life. If enzymes need energy to do work, that energy has to come from the energy in an ATP molecule. At least that's true for the vast majority of enzymes. Let's say 99% of the enzymes. I don't know what the exact percentage is, but the vast majority of enzymes, if they have to do work that requires energy, that energy has to come from a molecule of ATP. So when we look at ATP then, it falls into one of a couple of categories of reactions. But if we look at ATP, again, here's our adenosine and our triphosphates. When you hydrolyze that, essentially break it apart, so you add water to that, what we'll end up with is an ADP molecule, adenosine diphosphate, with a free phosphate. Now, at the end of this reaction, if we were to look at the amount of energy in the chemical bonds of the ATP and water and compare that to the amount of energy in the chemical bonds of the ADP and free phosphate, there would be less energy in the bonds after the reaction, less energy in the bonds of the products than there are in the reactants. So there's a net loss of energy to the surroundings. So when there's a release of energy to the surroundings, we refer to that as an exergonic reaction. And so again, enzymes then, if they need energy, they need it from this specific exergonic reaction, the hydrolysis of ATP. And so we represent that by what's known as a delta G. It's what's known as the change in Gibbs free energy. And in this particular case, a mole of ATP will yield 7.3 kilocalories of energy when it's broken apart. Now, one of the things that's counterintuitive here is that you'll notice that this is, when we talk about an exergonic reaction, that's a negative 7.3 kilocalories. And you might be thinking, well, if energy is released, shouldn't that be a positive number? Well, it goes back to what I talked about a second ago. There's less energy in the bonds of the products than there are in the reactants. So since there's less energy in the products, we represent that as a negative number, and that means that energy was released to the surroundings as a usable form of energy. So again, exergonic reactions release energy, and specifically, the hydrolysis of ATP releases 7.3 kilocalories per mole. Okay, now, if you wanted to make ATPs then, you'd have to take ADPs, so an ADP, and a free phosphate, and dehydration synthesis would restore or regenerate ATP. Now, there'd be more energy in these bonds than these, so that means energy has to go into the system. So we refer to those kind of reactions, energy-consuming reactions, as endergonic reactions. And if you want to make an ATP from an ADP and a phosphate, that's going to require 7.3 kilocalories of energy. Again, it's a plus because the products have more energy in the bonds than the reactants do, so energy had to go into the system. So endergonic reactions are energy-consuming reactions. Now, as I mentioned earlier, you might be wondering, and I'm going to scroll back to the previous slide here, if ATP releases energy and enzymes that carry out reactions require energy from ATP, what about enzymes that make ATP? Where do they get their energy from? Well, if those enzymes got their energy from ATP, we would be in this cycle. There'd be no, how do you do that? If you need ATP to make ATP, where's the energy coming from? So fortunately, the enzymes that make ATP do not require ATP as an energy source, and eventually we're going to learn where that energy comes from. But for now, I want to get back to the concept, and I want to reinforce this concept again, that ATP is the primary source of energy for enzymes when they need energy to do work. So let's look at an example of this. So let's say there's an enzyme then that wants to take a glutamic acid, and we're not going to use this whole diagram, but just to help you visualize a little bit. Let's say there's an enzyme that's going to take glutamic acid, add an ammonia to that to produce glutamine. And let's say that that enzyme requires 3.4 kilocalories of energy. So again, looking at the reaction, the enzyme's going to take glutamic acid and ammonia to produce glutamine. It requires 3.4 kilocalories of energy. So that's a plus value. So this is an endergonic reaction. It requires energy. So that enzyme then is going to have to use ATP as a source of energy. So ATP, you're going to hydrolyze that to form ADP and phosphates. That will release 7.3 kilocalories of energy. So this is one of the important things to know about ATP. Regardless of how much energy is required, it's an all or none reaction. ATP, that bond is broken, it's going to release 7.3 kilocalories of energy. It can't release just what's needed. It releases all that's in that particular set of bonds. So what about the difference then? Well, the difference, 3.9 kilocalories, is going to be released to the surroundings as heat. So that's the second law of energy again. When you transfer energy or change energy forms or run energy through a system, some of that energy is going to be lost to the surroundings as heat. Let's look at another example. Let's say there's an enzyme that's going to take some molecule A and molecule B and put them together to form molecule C. And let's say that takes just a tiny amount of energy, just 1/1000th of a kilocalorie. Well, again, the source of energy is going to have to be from ATP. ATP is going to release 7.3 kilocalories of energy, which means that 7.299 kilocalories of energy is released to the surroundings. So again, bottom line is that ATP can't release just what's needed. When that releases energy, it's the entire 7.3 kilocalories. So whatever is not consumed or used, lost to the surroundings as heat energy. So tremendously wasteful in some situations, no question about it. And we'll eventually come back to that issue, how can nature afford to be so wasteful? Well, part of the answer there is that we essentially have a limitless supply of energy. And the primary source of energy for all life really comes from the sun. And what's driving energy on the sun is a type of nuclear reaction, what's known as a fusion reaction. And so what we're looking at here is an isotope of hydrogen, deuterium. So we have a proton and a neutron, and a proton and two neutrons. So this would be tritium. And so normally what happens is that particles will collide with one another and bounce off. But at very high temperatures, such as we have on the sun, what happens is that deuterium and tritium can collide, and instead of bouncing off one another, they'll stick together. So this is in contrast to chemical reactions that involve electrons. Nuclear reactions involve the nuclei. And this is how all of the elements were generated, through fusion reactions. So what happens is that two protons and two neutrons stick together, they'll spit out one of the neutrons, and this now forms a new element, helium. Helium has two protons, you may recall. Now, when fusion reactions occur on the sun, releases a tremendous amount of energy. So when we look at nuclear reactions then, one of the hallmarks of a nuclear reaction is that there is a transition of mass to energy. And this is one of the things that was predicted by Einstein's famous equation, E equals mc squared. If you take something with mass and accelerate it to the square of speed of light, it transitions to energy, or it's equivalent to a certain value of energy. But the point is, a tiny mass, when you accelerate it to these kind of speeds, then releases a tremendous amount of energy. And some of that energy, could be heat energy, all kinds of energy, but some of that energy is going to be electromagnetic energy. And that's going to be emitted into space, and is emitted into space every day. So one of the reasons that nature can afford to be so inefficient is that we do have the sun, which functionally is a limitless supply of energy. And we'll talk about that flow of energy in a few minutes. All right, so the electromagnetic spectrum then is emitted into space. And the electromagnetic spectrum, you may recall that electromagnetic energy is a wave type of energy. So it's composed of tiny particles called photons, and the photons move through space in a wave-like pattern. And the distance from the crest of one wave to the crest of another we refer to as the wavelength. And again, there are tiny, tiny particles called photons which are moving in this wave-like pattern. So the shorter the wavelength, the more energy there is. The longer the wavelength, the less energy that is in that particular type of electromagnetic energy. So as we look at the electromagnetic spectrum then that is emitted into space, at the short end, where we're talking about wavelengths of just nanometers, we would have gamma rays. Then slightly longer wavelengths would be X-rays. Still longer, ultraviolet rays. Then that brings us to the visible spectrum, which I'll get back to in a second. Then longer still would be infrared, microwaves, and radio waves having the longest wavelengths. Now, in the visible spectrum then, we have adjacent to ultraviolet light, we would have violet, which is the shortest wavelengths. Adjacent to infrared, we would have red. Orange is almost red. Blue is almost violet. Yellow is almost orange. And then that leaves green in the middle. So you can kind of think your way through the spectrum here, but do understand that violet would be at one extreme, short wavelengths, red at the other. And this then, electromagnetic energy then strikes Earth and potentially is absorbed by plants. And we'll come back to this later, but plants are going to be absorbing mostly in the red-violet spectrum, or excuse me, red-orange spectrum, and also in the blue-violet spectrum. So some of this energy then strikes Earth and strikes plants. And so this is where energy now begins to transition into the living system. So light will be striking plants. It will penetrate the cells of the plants, strike the chloroplasts, where a process known as photosynthesis will occur, And what a photosynthesis, and we'll talk more about that in a second, but photosynthesis will generate organic molecules using solar energy. So, as we look at photosynthesis then, again, the overall equation is that carbon dioxide and water will be combined to form glucose and oxygen. And glucose, of course, is an organic molecule. There's a critical molecule, chlorophyll A, that's required for this. And again, we'll be talking about this process in great detail later. So we're just looking at this as an overview. But it also requires 686 kilocalories of solar energy then to generate 1 glucose. Okay, so photosynthesis then, basically there are 2 parts to it. There's what's known as the light reaction or light-dependent reaction. In this step, solar energy is converted to chemical energy in the form of ATP. We're going to learn how that's done at a later time. But the point is, first convert solar energy, which is really not very usable, to a usable form of energy, ATP. This process also releases oxygen, so the oxygen we breathe is actually a byproduct of photosynthesis. And then there's another subphase known as the dark reaction, where inorganic molecules, carbon dioxide and water, are combined to form glucose. And that work is done using the ATP generated in the light reaction. So again, we'll come back to these later, but the point is solar energy converted to chemical energy in the form of ATP, then ATP is used to construct glucose. So again, solar energy becomes the source to combine inorganic molecules into organic molecules, and then oxygen is released. Now, the energy that was solar energy and then was trapped in chemical energy of ATP now is trapped in the carbon-carbon bonds of organic molecules. So that energy now can then be passed through the food chain to other organisms, organisms that have mitochondria in particular. And organisms with mitochondria can carry out a process known as the cellular oxidation of glucose. And essentially, we're looking at the opposite reaction. Glucose can be combined with oxygen to form carbon dioxide and water. The purpose of deconstructing the glucose is that in that process, energy is released. This is an exergonic reaction. 686 kilocalories is released, and some of that can be trapped in ATPs. Some of it, in fact, most of it will be lost as heat, but at least some of it can be formed in ATPs. So the point of the cellular oxidation of glucose then is to regenerate ATP so that those cells and organisms can carry out the chemical reactions that they need to do. So cellular oxidation of glucose also basically has 2 parts to it, and again, we'll learn a lot about this in more detail, so it's an overview right now. So glycolysis occurs in the cytoplasm of the cell, and by that I mean really not within mitochondria, and that will generate 2 ATPs per glucose. And then there's another phase known as cellular respiration, which occurs within the mitochondria, which will produce somewhere between 32 and 34 ATP. So again, cells with mitochondria can be a lot more efficient and generate more ATPs. So again, as we kind of look at the overall process then, carbon dioxide's in water, solar energy converted to ATP, chemical energy. That's used to generate organic molecules so that that energy is now trapped in the carbon-carbon bonds of the organic molecules. Then within mitochondria, those can be deconstructed back into carbon dioxide and water. That will generate ATP to carry out other enzyme reactions that require energy. And eventually that energy is going to degrade as heat. So as we look at the flow of energy in nature, then solar energy comes in, it's converted to chemical energy, heat energy goes out, and then as long as there's more solar energy, the plants can reconstruct the organic molecules. So this is the basis of food chains then. Plants, and we're just going to stay on the terrestrial side here, but plants are the producers. They take inorganic molecules and produce organic molecules. Animals can't do that. So when people say plants can't do anything, that's the farthest thing from the truth. They're making the organic molecules. And then the rest of us are consumers. We're consuming the food. We're consuming the organic molecules for the energy they contain. So plant is eaten by a grasshopper in this case, so it becomes the primary consumer. Grasshopper is eaten by a mouse or a shrew, I can't tell what it is from the picture. It becomes a secondary consumer in our food chain. If the mouse is consumed by a rattlesnake in this case, the rattlesnake serves as a tertiary consumer. Rattlesnake is consumed by red-tailed hawk, it becomes the quaternary consumer, and so on. So energy then is flowing through the ecosystem. We refer to all of the consumers, secondary consumers and above, as higher order consumers. and sometimes collectively we refer to them as that. So again, each step in the food chain, initially the producers are making the organic molecules, and then it's primary, secondary, tertiary, quaternary, and so on in terms of where you are in the food chain. So the food chain then is how energy is transferred. And certainly there are marine and aquatic food chains which are the equivalent to that. Now, certainly in ecosystems, food chains do not occur in isolation. So, for example, if we're looking at aquatic food chain, phytoplankton would not just be consumed by a particular organism. It could be consumed by lots of different organisms. And so when we look at all of the combined food chains in an ecosystem, it forms what we call the food web. Now, some other terms that we use when we talk about organisms in food chains and food webs, so one would be herbivore. This is essentially a synonym for a primary consumer. So if an organism is serving primarily feeding on vegetation, we refer to that animal as an herbivore. An example of that here is a pronghorn that we taped up in the Yellowstone ecosystem. Carnivores are meat eaters. Cats are the classic carnivore. They eat really exclusively meat. Occasionally, if they're sick or something, you may see them feeding on grasses, but the cats are just classic carnivores. Wolves also would be a really good example of a carnivore. This example of a gray wolf, again, up in the Yellowstone ecosystem that we taped this summer. Humans would be omnivores. So omnivores can serve not only as higher order consumers, but also as primary consumers. And of course, humans would be examples of omnivores. Now, sometimes animals that you might think of as a carnivore, something like the coyote here, is actually an omnivore as well. So coyotes will eat pretty much anything. Another example would be the grizzly bear. So grizzly bears, depending what ecosystem they're in, get anywhere from 40 to 60% of their calories from vegetation. So you have to be a little careful sometimes in terms of whether something is taxonomically a quote-unquote carnivore. Here we're talking about their ecological function. Ecologically, this would be an omnivore. A couple of other terms that we don't really see a lot of times in food chains, but we need to consider. Detritivores would be animals that feed on decaying organic matter, millipedes, beetles, things like that. Decomposers is a term that's usually used for microscopic organisms that cause decomposition and feed on dead and decaying organisms. Autotrophs are organisms, this would be a synonym for producers. So autotrophs are so-called self-feeding. So autotroph, troph is a reference to food or feeding, auto means self. So the producers can make their own food is basically what this is saying. So they can produce their own food. You and I are heterotrophs, so consumers are heterotrophs, so we have to get our food from other sources. We can't make it ourselves. Now, again, as we look at the flow of energy then, one of the things that's really important to consider is the inefficiency in nature. So, for example, we have a caterpillar that's feeding on a leaf here. There's 200 joules of energy that it's going to consume. Most of that energy is just going to go out in the feces. Some of that energy will actually go into new biomass. And again, a big part of it will be lost as heat, essentially in cellular respiration. So the 200 joules of energy consumed, only 33 actually become part of the tissue of the organism. So when we look at the flow of energy in ecosystems then, there's tremendous inefficiency. And when we look at any ecosystem, essentially what we have is what's known as a pyramid, an energy pyramid. So of the energy then that strikes plants, only a fraction of that energy actually is incorporated in the tissues of that plant. So the producers, if we were to look at all the energy in the producers, that's known as the first trophic level, and there'd be a certain amount of energy there. Then, if we looked at all of the primary consumers in the ecosystem and looked at all of the energy in their tissues, you'll notice that we've gone from 10,000 joules to only 1,000 joules. That's known as the second trophic level. If we look at all of the tertiary consumers, the energy in their tissues, that forms a certain amount of energy. Again, if we went from 1,000 joules to only 100 joules, that's the third trophic level. And then if we looked at the energy in the tissues of the tertiary consumers, again, there would be only a tenth of that. That's known as the fourth trophic level, and so on. But what's typical of an energy pyramid, and hopefully you can see this, is that we're only about 10% of the energy in one stage of an ecosystem gets to the next step of the ecosystem. So we refer to this as the 10% rule of nature. So only about 10% of the energy goes from one step in the food chain to the next step in the food chain to the next step in the food chain to the next step in the food chain. So that means then that 90% of the energy in each step in the food chain is lost to the surroundings as heat. So that's a tremendously inefficient system. And really a tiny fraction of the energy that strikes the plants actually is utilized, way less than 1% actually. This shows about 1%, but it's usually less than that. So, how can nature afford to be so inefficient? Well, it really all goes back to the sun. Again, we have this fusion reaction ongoing, and every day the sun comes up, in the evening it goes down, but every day it comes up again. So we effectively have a limitless supply of energy, and even though we're relatively inefficient in nature, only 10% gets to the next level, and we lose 90% due to the second law of energy, it works because we're all still here. So this has implications then for our own food supply, because there's certainly concerns about our food supply as we move into the future. Population is growing rapidly. We have ecological concerns facing us. So for example, if we take our grains and we feed that to livestock, only about 1/10 of the energy in grain gets to the livestock, only about 1/10 of the energy in the livestock gets to the human. So that means only about 1/100th of the energy that was originally in the grain is actually incorporated into our tissues. Now, if we just move down one step in the food chain, if we feed on the grains directly, then we'll only get 1/10 of that energy. But by moving one step down in the food chain, we've just increased our food supply by 10 times. So again, this is an important concept to consider, again, especially as food supply becomes more critical. And one of the things certainly that will happen over time is that food is going to become more expensive. So it's a lot more expensive to take your food, grains, feed it to animals, and then consume that as well. So again, as we look forward then, over the next decades, one of the concerns, certainly has to do with global warming. One of the concerns about global warming is that it's going to change climate patterns. Climate patterns will alter our food productivity, water distribution, and so on. And so one of the real concerns that ecologists have as we look, towards our future is how are we going to potentially deal with this change in food supply? Population's increasing, food supply may not keep up with that. One of the ways that we may do that is to, really eat less meat. And ultimately that may be an economic decision for all of us because it just may be too expensive to eat meat. I guess that's something to look forward to. See you next time.